Baltimore, 1990. A plane lands at Baltimore, Washington International Airport. Not just any plane, the Trump shuttle. Donald Trump's personal airline, the one he put his name on in gold letters, the one he bought from Eastern Airlines for $365 million, the one that flew businessmen and politicians and the specific class of people who moved between New York and the East Coast's major cities on a schedule that made driving feel beneath them. The door opens. A young black man from the South Bronx walks off. He is 22 years old. He has no briefcase, no business card, no company name, no title that the legitimate world would recognize. He walks through the terminal. Outside, a limousine is waiting. He gets in. The driver takes him to the Inner Harbor, to one of Baltimore's finest hotels. He checks in, goes to his room, and waits. Because $30,000 is coming to him. Cash. For 1 week's work. In a city that is not his city. In a state that had never seen anyone like him before. His name was Charles Guy. The streets called him Billy Guy. He called himself something else entirely. The Great Billy Guy. And at 23 years old, he would make the kind of history in Maryland that no black man before him ever had, the bad kind. The South Bronx in the 1980s was not a place that produced men who flew to other cities on Donald Trump's airline to collect money. The South Bronx was a place that produced men who survived. The specific devastation of the Bronx in the late 70s and early 80s, the fires, the abandonment, the specific collapse of an American urban neighborhood that became a national symbol of everything that had gone wrong with American cities, created a geography of scarcity that ran completely parallel to the geography of wealth that existed in other parts of New York City. Charlotte Street in the South Bronx became the most photographed block in America. Presidents came to look at it. Jimmy Carter stood there in 1977 and shook his head. Ronald Reagan stood there in 1980 and made promises. The photographers came and went. The television cameras came and went. The people who lived there stayed. And the boys who grew up there made calculations based on what they could actually see, not what politicians promised, what was visible, what was present, what the economy actually offered a young man from the South Bronx who opened his eyes in the morning and looked at his options. The legitimate economy offered specific things, jobs that required credentials he didn't have, wages that would never close the gap between where he was and where he could see wealth being accumulated by people whose starting point had been completely different from his. The specific slow accumulation of a legitimate life in a neighborhood where slow accumulation meant staying exactly where you were while the rest of the city moved past you. The alternative calculation was faster. Billy Guy made the alternative calculation young. He was getting money since he was a youngin'. His name stretched out across popular cities on the East Coast before he was old enough to rent a car legally. The specific organizational intelligence that the South Bronx had been developing in him, the understanding of supply and demand, of territory, of customer relationships, of the specific logistics that moving product across a neighborhood requires, was being applied at a scale that most men twice his age had never attempted. He understood something that most operators in his position never fully grasped. The biggest money was not in your own neighborhood. Your own neighborhood knew you. Your own neighborhood had its existing operators, its existing supply chains, its existing territorial arrangements that would require violence and time to disrupt. Your own neighborhood was a market you understood, but it was also a market that understood you. A different city was a different calculation entirely. A city that didn't know your name yet, a city where the supply constraints were creating the kind of opportunity that only appeared when a market was underserved. He looked at Baltimore, and he saw exactly what Baltimore was. Baltimore in the late 1980s was a city in transition. The heroin market that had defined the city's underground economy for decades was evolving. The specific supply chains that had fed Baltimore's addiction since the 1960s, the same chains that had made Peanut King and Little Melvin Williams the most powerful figures in Baltimore's underground economy, were being disrupted by federal prosecutions and the specific organizational chaos that followed the takedown of major operators. Peanut King was in federal prison. The organization he had built, the one that had dominated East Baltimore with $50 million per year and computers in the boardroom, was gone. The territory he had controlled was contested. The supply chains he had managed were disrupted. Baltimore was hungry. Billy Guy arrived into that hunger. He opened shop at a time when the only supply available on Baltimore's streets was being sold in $30 bags. $30, the specific retail price point that tells you about a market's supply constraints. When product is scarce, prices rise. When prices rise, the operator who can guarantee consistent supply at better prices controls everything. Every dealer on every corner who is paying a premium for inconsistent product will immediately switch to the man who can offer consistency and volume. Billy Guy could offer both. He guaranteed his Baltimore lieutenants unlimited supply from his South Bronx connections. Unlimited. Not as much as they could get elsewhere. Not better quality than someone else was offering. Unlimited, a word that in a market defined by scarcity functions like a declaration of total power. He also promised them each $10,000 a week, per lieutenant. He was 22 years old, from the South Bronx, promising Baltimore men $10,000 per week, guaranteed, backed by unlimited supply from his New York connections. They believed him because he delivered. The operation took root in Baltimore's Eastern District. Anthony Simmons, 21 years old, ran the day-to-day in Baltimore as the head of Billy Guy's local enterprise. Street dealers, couriers, the specific organizational hierarchy of a distribution network that had to function when its owner was back in New York. And it functioned. $30,000 a week flowing back to Billy Guy while he was in the Bronx. The money moved through wire transfers that Eastern District vice officers eventually traced. $125,000 in documented money transfers from Baltimore to New York. Moving from the men, Simmons managed to the South Bronx bank accounts that Billy Guy was collecting from. He used it to buy diamonds for his many girlfriends. Prosecutor Stephen May, the man who would eventually stand up in Baltimore Circuit Court and describe what Billy Guy had built, said it with the specific dry precision that prosecutors use when they want a jury to understand the scale of what they are looking at. It was chump change, $125,000 in traced wire transfers. Chump change. The documented amount was only what the government could prove. The full operation was generating far more, $30,000 per week across the weeks he was operating. The specific arithmetic of a supply chain that ran whether Billy Guy was in Baltimore or in the South Bronx or on the Trump shuttle between the two. The Trump shuttle. That detail deserves its own moment. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Donald Trump owned a shuttle airline that operated between New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Launched in 1989 after Trump purchased the Eastern Airlines shuttle operation for $365 million. The specific audacity of a man who put his name on an airline, who branded the experience, who added gold-colored fixtures to the planes, who made flying between New York and the other East Coast cities a statement about who you were and what you could afford. 3 cities. Frequent departures. the specific convenience of a shuttle service designed for the business traveler who moved between major East Coast cities regularly. Billy Guy was a regular, a 22-year-old from the South Bronx on the Trump shuttle from New York to Baltimore. Not because he couldn't drive, not because the ticket was cheap. The Trump shuttle was not a budget airline, because the Trump shuttle was what a man used when he moved between New York and another city, frequently enough that driving felt beneath the pace of his operation. He was building an empire that required his presence in two cities simultaneously. The Trump shuttle was the infrastructure that made it possible. When he wasn't on the Trump shuttle, he was in a limousine, a rented limousine traveling from the airport to the Inner Harbor, to Baltimore's finest hotels, where $30,000 was waiting for him. The image of that, a young man from the South Bronx arriving at the Inner Harbor in a limousine to collect $30,000 per week, is the image that the Baltimore newspapers eventually put in front of their readers when the story finally broke. And the readers of those newspapers understood immediately what they were looking at. They were looking at something Baltimore had never seen before. A 22-year-old from the South Bronx who had treated Baltimore like a business expansion, who had identified a market, established a supply chain, recruited and managed talent, and built a wire transfer system, all while living in New York and visiting via Donald Trump's airline. When Billy Guy came home after 11 years, he was in his early 30s, the specific age at which men who have spent formative years inside federal facilities emerge, old enough to understand what they lost, young enough to believe they can build something different. Baltimore had changed around him. The crack era that had dominated the late 1980s had given way to something different. The specific supply chains and organizational structures had evolved. New names, new territories, new operations. But the fundamental economics had not changed. The demand was still there. The specific market logic that Billy Guy had identified when he was 22, that Baltimore was a city with extraordinary demand, and that the man who could guarantee consistent supply controlled everything, was still true 20 years later. According to the FBI, Billy Guy could not resist that logic. Federal authorities alleged he became part of a heroin conspiracy centered in Baltimore that stretched from Washington, D.C. to New York City and into Anne Arundel County. The same geography, the same product, the same man. He pleaded not guilty to the second indictment, but the fact that the FBI was watching him again, that federal authorities had identified him as a significant enough figure in Baltimore's drug trade to build a new federal case around him, told you everything about what Billy Guy represented. He was not a man who could be contained by a single prosecution, not by 20 years that became 11, not by the first Kingpin conviction in Maryland's history. The great Billy Guy, still going, not great in the colloquial sense, not great the way that people use the word as a superlative without thinking about what it actually means. Great in the specific sense that a man means it when he believes he has built something extraordinary. And by 22 years old, he had. The operation he had established in Baltimore from his South Bronx base was not a simple distribution network. It was an organizational achievement. He had identified a market, Baltimore in the late 1980s, a city with limited supply at retail prices that told him immediately there was money to be made by anyone who could offer consistency and volume. He had established his supply chain. The South Bronx connections that guaranteed unlimited supply to his Baltimore lieutenants. The specific vertical integration of a man who controlled both the supply end and the distribution end of his operation. He had recruited and managed talent. Anthony Simmons, at 21, young enough to have the energy the operation required, experienced enough to manage the day-to-day without Billy Guy present. The street dealers and couriers who formed the base of the organization. He had established his financial infrastructure, the wire transfer system that moved $30,000 per week from Baltimore to New York, the diamonds that converted cash into assets that could not be easily seized. He had built a bi-state operation at 22 years old, from the South Bronx, via the Trump shuttle, to the Baltimore Inner Harbor. And he had done it quietly enough that law enforcement spent months trying to understand what they were looking at before they could act. They acted. The Eastern District vice officers had been watching, following the money transfers, tracing the wire transactions, building the specific evidentiary case that Maryland's new drug kingpin law required. Maryland had passed its drug kingpin law specifically to address the kind of organizational leadership that Billy Guy represented. Not the street dealer, not the courier, the man at the top, the man who organized, directed, and managed a drug enterprise at scale. The man whose removal would actually affect the operation, rather than simply creating a vacancy that someone else would fill. The law was new. Nobody had ever been convicted under it. The prosecutors who built the case against Billy Guy understood what they were doing. They were not just prosecuting a drug operator, they were establishing the precedent for how Maryland would use its most powerful tool against drug organizations going forward. The first conviction would set the standard. The first conviction would tell every future defendant and every future defense attorney exactly what the law meant in practice. They wanted to make sure the first conviction was the right one. Billy Guy was the right one. 25 of his co-conspirators pleaded guilty before the case went to circuit court. Street dealers, couriers, the men who had been doing the work that Billy Guy's organization required. They took their deals, and they cooperated, and they built the record that the prosecutor needed. Anthony Simmons, the 21-year-old who had been running Baltimore for Billy Guy, pleaded guilty to conspiracy and smuggling. In exchange for dropping the kingpin charge against him, prosecutors agreed to recommend a 10-year sentence without parole. Simmons took the deal. He had watched what happened to men who tried to fight the state when the state had 25 cooperating witnesses and a paper trail of wire transfers. And then Billy Guy stood before Judge Thomas Ward in Baltimore Circuit Court. He was 23 years old, small gold crucifix hanging over his blue sweatsuit. The man who had been flying in on the Trump shuttle to collect $30,000 a week, the man who had wired $125,000 from Baltimore to New York for diamonds for his many girlfriends, was standing in a courtroom in a blue sweatsuit with a gold crucifix. The great Billy Guy. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy and smuggling. He pleaded not guilty to the kingpin charge. His defense was specific. The kingpin statute required proof of organizational leadership at a certain scale. His attorneys would argue that the facts did not meet that threshold, that the charges exceeded what the evidence actually showed. Judge Thomas Ward heard the arguments. Judge Thomas Ward heard the facts. And then Judge Thomas Ward made history. He convicted Billy Guy under Maryland's drug kingpin statute, not the jury. The judge, after hearing the facts in the case, determined that the evidence met the threshold. Charles Guy, 23 years old, South Bronx, Trump shuttle, Inner Harbor limousines, $30,000 per week, diamonds for his many girlfriends, became the first person ever convicted under Maryland's newly enacted drug kingpin law. Mandatory sentence, 20 years without the possibility of parole. The Baltimore Sun ran a headline, "Yesterday, the lavish lifestyle ended for the man who called himself the Great Billy Guy." They were wrong. The conviction was overturned, not because the facts were wrong, not because the jury had made an error or the evidence had been mishandled. On legal technicalities, the specific procedural mechanisms that the American appellate system uses to review whether trials were conducted properly, Billy Guy's conviction under Maryland's drug kingpin statute was reversed. He did not serve 20 years. He served 11 years. 11 years for building a bi-state operation that generated $30,000 per week, for flying the Trump shuttle to collect diamonds and money, for being the first man in Maryland's history to be convicted under the drug kingpin law. 11 years. He came home. When Billy Guy came home, he was in his early 30s, the specific age at which men who have spent their formative years inside federal facilities emerge, old enough to understand what they lost, young enough to believe they can build something different. Baltimore had changed around him. The specific drug economy that he had entered in the late 1980s had evolved through the 1990s and into the 2000s. New organizations, new supply chains, new faces. The city that had made him the first person ever convicted under Maryland's Kingpin statute had not paused while he was inside. It had kept moving. And eventually, according to the FBI, so did he. Years after his release, federal authorities indicted Billy Guy again. A heroin conspiracy centered in Baltimore, a network that stretched from Washington, D.C. to New York City and into Anne Arundel County. The same geography, the same product, the same man. The FBI alleged he was part of an organization that connected multiple states and multiple markets, the same operational logic that had made him famous the first time. He pleaded not guilty. There are men in American criminal history who define an era, whose operations were so significant, whose organizational achievements were so extraordinary for their time and their age, that law enforcement and legislatures had to build new structures specifically to address them. Billy Guy was one of those men. Maryland passed its drug kingpin statute to prosecute exactly the kind of man he was. The organizer, the man who built the structure and managed the relationships and guaranteed the supply and collected the money while other men did the street-level work. The law was waiting for him. He became the first man it ever claimed. At 23 years old, flying the Trump shuttle, staying at the Inner Harbor's finest hotels, buying diamonds with chump change, calling himself the Great Billy Guy, and in Baltimore Circuit Court, in a blue sweatsuit with a small gold crucifix, he became a footnote in Maryland legal history. The first, the youngest, the man who built it from the South Bronx while flying Donald Trump's airline, Charles Guy, the Great Billy Guy.